Picture this. You're driving through, just a typical American neighborhood.
Manicured lawns, quiet streets.
Right, exactly. Maybe you see like a stray sprinkler lazily ticking back and forth in the afternoon sun. The houses are all painted in these very harmonious shades of beige and slate.
It looks perfectly serene, like the ultimate suburban dream.
Yeah, but under the surface of that perfectly trimmed grass, there's actually a really complex, almost invisible web of rules, regulations, and increasingly simmering tension.
Because you aren't just looking at a neighborhood, you are looking at a governed micro-society.
Right, and I was pulling some of the demographic context before we started today, and the numbers for 2026 are just wild. About 80 million Americans are currently living in Homeowners Association, or HOA, governed communities.
Which is a staggering demographic reality.
Think about that for a second. I mean, that is a third of all housing in the United States.
We're talking about tens of millions of people whose daily lives, from, the color they can paint their front door to where they can park their car, are dictated by a localized governing board.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because that number honestly blew my mind. And it's not like this is some legacy relic from the 1980s suburban boom either.
Not at all.
According to the data, 66% of new homes built in 2025 were in HOAs. Two-thirds.
It's incredible.
Right. If you are buying a new house today, avoiding an HOA is genuinely difficult. You almost have to go out of your way, maybe, look for rural property or very specific older urban grids just to find a place that isn't attached to one of these associations.
And that sheer volume, that unavoidable scale is exactly why we're pulling out the microscope for this deep dive today. We are looking at a really comprehensive synthesis of where community living is right now.
Yeah, we've got a massive stack of research today.
We do. It's a structured literature review that analyzed 128 academic papers. And what's fascinating is that researchers filtered those down from over 9 million retrieved studies across global databases.
Wait, 9 million down to 128. I mean, that tells me they were looking for the absolute signal in the noise.
They absolutely were. They mapped out everything from sociological behavior in closed communities to the economic impacts of local governance.
We are pairing that empirical research with the newly updated 2026 HOA Conflict Resolution and Mediation Framework, right?
Correct. Because with 80 million people living under these rules, the disputes are no longer just, petty arguments over the height of a fence.
They're getting serious.
Very. We are dealing with complex power dynamics, rising financial pressures, and brand new legal mandates that are fundamentally changing how people live next to each other. So today is about understanding those mechanisms and the battle-tested strategies for navigating them.
Well, to really grasp the solutions, I feel like we first have to look at why these neighborhoods are feeling so much more tense lately.
Absolutely. The baseline level of conflict has definitely shifted.
Yeah, the data shows this measurable spike in conflict in 2026. It isn't just anecdotal, like people aren't just complaining on social media more. The actual volume of formal disputes, legal actions, and mediations is surging.
Let's start with the physical footprint just to set the stage. There are currently about 377,000 community associations in the U.S.
Wow.
And they are adding 3,000 to 4,000 new ones every single year. But the geographical growth is really only the backdrop here.
Right. The real issue is money.
Always. The primary engine of this tension, according to the sociological data, is severe compounding financial strain.
Let's talk about the money, because that is always where the friction originates. The median HOA fee right now is around $135 a month.
Which doesn't sound terrible on its own.
On the surface, maybe that doesn't sound world-ending. But the distribution curve is what's really alarming here. There are 3 million households paying over $500 a month.
That is a massive chunk of change.
I mean, that's a car payment or a big piece of a mortgage. Just go into the association before you even pay for your own utilities or property taxes.
And that financial burden is the literal catalyst for the 2026 boiling point. The literature points directly to external economic pressures that HOAs have zero control over.
Like what?
Well, for example, national insurance premiums for these associations have spiked by 8% on average. But when researchers looked at regions with higher climate or structural risks, places like Florida and California, they found staggering increases.
How staggering.
We are talking 25% to 50% spikes in the master insurance policies that the HOA is legally required to carry.
Wait, if the master policy for the neighborhood goes up by 50%, the HOA doesn't just have a magical vault of cash sitting around.
No, they don't.
They have to get that money from somewhere, which means they are passing that cost directly to the homeowner, right?
Right.
Through increased monthly dues or special assessments.
That is the mechanical reality of it, yeah. And when HOAs are forced to raise fees significantly, two behavioral shifts happen simultaneously.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, the board of directors feels immense pressure to justify those higher costs. They are suddenly taking a lot of money out of their neighbors' pockets, so they feel this intense fiduciary duty to maintain or increase property values.
Which makes sense.
It does, but that psychological pressure almost always translates into much stricter enforcement of the rules. They start policing the neighborhood a lot more aggressively.
Oh, I see. So they're walking the sidewalks looking for, like, unapproved paint colors or overgrown weeds.
Exactly, because they need the neighborhood to look pristine to justify that massive expense.
Right. And the second shift is on the homeowner side, obviously. Because if my dues jump from $200 to $400 a month, my expectations skyrocket.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm no longer going to be forgiving if the community pool is closed for maintenance or if the landscaping crew misses a week. I mean, when people pay more, they become highly, highly sensitive to perceived administrative inefficiency.
The research maps this exact correlation. High financial burden severely lowers the tolerance for administrative error. Furthermore, the studies show that today's residents are significantly better informed about their legal rights than they used to be.
Like their property rights and the specific bylaws.
Yes, they are much more literate in those areas than they were even 5 years ago.
Because they can just pull up the neighborhood covenants on their phone now. They aren't just taking a citation and mailing a check quietly anymore.
Right. They are actively pushing back. They're scrutinizing the rule book to see if the board actually followed the proper procedure.
So if we look at the structure here, an HOA is basically a hyper-local, microscopic government.
That's a good way to frame it.
But instead of trained civil servants, your mayor is just the guy next door who, I don't know, might have volunteered because he really hates weeds.
Yeah.
I have to wonder, is this inherent lack of professional governance the actual root cause of why these financial pressures turn into explosive disputes? I mean, these are volunteers. They aren't trained in diplomacy or municipal management.
When the researchers analyzed those millions of data points, they explicitly validated that suspicion. Power imbalances and inconsistent enforcement by volunteer boards are cited as the primary triggers for conflict escalation.
It's just human nature.
Think about the human element, yeah. You have a neighbor who suddenly possesses the authority to issue financial penalties to another neighbor. Without rigid professional protocols, basic human nature takes over.
Right, because if I'm on the board and, my friend 3 houses down leaves his trash cans out, I might just look the other way.
Exactly.
But if the guy across the street who plays his music too loud leaves his trash cans out, I might write him up.
And that creeping favoritism, whether conscious or unconscious, is exactly what turns a minor infraction into a multi-year legal battle.
People hate hypocrisy.
They do. The data shows that homeowners don't usually sue over the trash can itself. They sue over the perceived hypocrisy of the enforcement.
And because these microscopic governments were failing so spectacularly to resolve these conflicts internally, we are seeing actual state governments having to step in to regulate the regulators.
Which brings us to the new legal landscape of 2026.
The shift here is massive.
It really is a paradigm shift. For decades, the default mechanism for a severe HOA dispute was litigation.
To sue them.
Right. A homeowner would sue the board for overreach, or the board would sue the homeowner for breach of contract. It was practically a reflex to file a lawsuit.
But that's so expensive.
Incredibly expensive. And the state legal systems finally recognized that clogging up the county courts with neighborhood disputes over fence heights or paint colors is just unsustainable.
Not to mention, it's financially ruinous for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Especially since the homeowner is often indirectly paying the HOA's legal fees through their own dues anyway.
Exactly. The sources highlight Colorado's 2025 HOA mediation law, HB 25-1123, which took full effect in 2026. It really seems to be acting as the new national blueprint.
So what does the law actually do?
It essentially strips away the ability to just call a lawyer and file a lawsuit. It legally requires a strict step-by-step sequence.
So you can't just jump to the nuclear option anymore.
No. The legislation mandates a tiered approach. Informal negotiation comes first.
Yeah.
If that fails, you are legally required to attempt formal mediation. Only if both of those avenues are completely exhausted can you resort to litigation as a final option.
The mechanism they use to enforce this is fascinating to me. They introduce something called a certificate of compliance.
Yes, the certificate is the key.
Right, so neither the HOA board nor the homeowner can even file a lawsuit without presenting the certificate to the court clerk, proving that they attempted mediation first.
And judges are enforcing this very aggressively.
Really?
Yes, if a party tries to bypass the mediation step and file a lawsuit directly, the courts are empowered to either stay the case, meaning they freeze all legal proceedings until mediation happens, or completely dismiss the lawsuit with prejudice.
Wow. But the penalties get even sharper, specifically for the boards, right?
They do. If an HOA board decides they want to be stubborn and bypass these new alternative dispute resolution rules, the court can bar them from recovering their attorney fees.
So even if the board goes to trial and completely wins the underlying argument about the fence, they still have to eat the legal costs if they didn't mediate first.
Exactly. And here is the mechanism that truly shifts the power dynamic. Repeated non-compliance with this mandated sequence can expose volunteer board members to personal liability.
Okay, wait, stop right there. Explain how that works. Because normally an HOA is a corporate entity, right? It's an LLC or a nonprofit corporation.
Yes, usually.
That corporate structure is supposed to shield the individual volunteers from being sued personally. Like, they can't come after your house.
It does, generally, under the doctrine of the corporate veil. Furthermore, boards carry directors and officers insurance, or D&O insurance, which pays for their legal defense if they are sued for decisions they make while on the board.
Right, so they're covered.
Usually. However, state laws like Colorado's introduce a critical caveat. If a board member willfully ignores the state-mandated dispute resolution laws, courts can rule that they are acting outside the scope of their official duties.
Oh, wow. So they piece the corporate veil?
Yes, the judge can determine that the individual board member was acting recklessly or in bad faith by ignoring the statute.
And then what happens?
When that happens, the D&O insurance policy can deny coverage, leaving the volunteer board member personally responsible for the damages and legal fees.
That is nuts. I mean, if I'm a volunteer board member and I find out that mismanaging a dispute with the guy down the street could put my own personal savings or my retirement at risk, why in the world would I ever volunteer for this job?
It's a very fair question.
It seems like this law would completely empty out these boards. Who takes on that kind of liability for zero pay?
That is a very common initial reaction, and it was heavily debated in the literature leading up to these laws. But if we look at the empirical evidence of how these laws actually function in practice, this mandatory mediation framework doesn't expose board members.
It doesn't.
No, it actually protects them, provided they follow the steps.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that.
Mm-hmm.
How does a law that threatens personal liability actually act as a shield?
It acts as a shield by providing an objective, state-sanctioned checklist.
Okay, a checklist.
Right. Before these laws existed, a homeowner could sue a board member simply because they felt the board was acting arbitrarily or maliciously. The board member would then have to go to court and try to prove their intent was pure, which is incredibly difficult and expensive.
Because it's just one person's word against another's.
Exactly. Now, the law provides a rigid sequence of due process.
Oh, I see. So if the homeowner sues, the board member doesn't have to argue about their feelings or intentions. They just point to the paperwork.
Precisely. They present the file and say, we followed step 1, step 2, and step 3 exactly as the statute requires.
That makes total sense.
By removing the ambiguity of how a dispute should be handled, the mandatory mediation laws reduce the overall likelihood of costly litigation. It forces boards to act deliberately rather than reactively, which empirically decreases their overall exposure to liability. The checklist is their armor.
And this isn't isolated to just one state, right? The researchers note that Florida, California, Nevada, Washington, and Virginia are all actively expanding similar homeowner rights based on this exact model.
We are watching a nationwide shift in real time. The era of the unchecked, litigious HOA board is rapidly coming to an end. The mandate now is alternative dispute resolution, or ADR.
So now that the law demands this specific sequence, we have to look at the practical application. Like, how do you stop a neighborly dispute from escalating into a situation where you need that certificate of compliance in the first place?
Well, according to the 2026 framework, it all hinges on the first 2 days. They refer to it as the golden 48 hours.
The golden 48 hours.
Yeah.
This is stage 1 of the new framework, informal resolution. And the bedrock of this stage is that 24 to 48-hour window. The framework dictates that boards must acknowledge a complaint in writing within this time frame.
Notice that the framework doesn't say resolve the complaint in 48 hours. It just says acknowledge it.
Right, just a quick, we got it.
Exactly. The reasoning here is deeply rooted in the behavioral psychology studies we looked at earlier. The data reveals a fascinating pattern. Residents are almost always angrier about the wait time and the feeling of being ignored than they are about the original issue itself.
That makes profound psychological sense, actually. Say you are fuming because your neighbor's dog has been barking for 3 straight hours.
Right.
You finally snap and send an angry email to the property manager or the board. If you hear nothing back, your brain starts spinning a narrative.
Of course it does.
You start thinking, they don't care. They are taking his side. They are useless.
Yeah.
By the time the board replies 3 weeks later, you are no longer mad at the dog. You are furious at the institution.
That phenomenon is called secondary anger, and it is a massive escalation trigger. A delayed response takes an interpersonal conflict and transforms it into an institutional betrayal.
Institutional betrayal?
Yes. The 48-hour rule acts as a pressure release valve, stopping that secondary anger from forming. It tells the homeowner, you have been heard.
But the framework goes further, doesn't it?
It does. Once the complaint is acknowledged, the board is instructed to employ the separate conversations rule.
I wanted to dig into this, actually, because it feels counterintuitive to me. The rule states that boards must speak to each party separately during the informal stage.
Yes.
My instinct, if 2 neighbors are fighting over a property line or noise, would be to get them in a room, sit them down with a cup of coffee, and just hash it out together like adults.
Yeah.
Why does the framework strictly forbid that approach?
Because putting 2 people in a room together when emotions are raw is statistically a recipe for disaster. Oh, definitely. You have to remember the board's role at this informal stage. They are not judges, and they are not professional mediators. They are fact gatherers.
Well,
If you put both feuding neighbors in a room, the board member inevitably has to act as a moderator. They have to tell one person to stop talking and let the other speak. The moment a board member does that, they appear to be taking a side.
oh, I see. Which instantly destroys their neutrality.
Exactly. By speaking to them separately, the board maintains strict neutrality. They allow each person to vent their frustrations without the other person interrupting or rolling their eyes.
It de-escalates the immediate tension.
Right. It allows the board to figure out what the actual factual disagreement is beneath all the emotional noise.
The language the framework suggests using during these separate conversations is really deliberate, too.
Yeah.
They advise replacing a phrase like, we received a complaint about you, with an open question like, help me understand the situation from your perspective.
That linguistic shift is absolutely crucial for de-escalation.
Why is that?
Well, when a board member says, we received a complaint about you, it acts as an accusation. It immediately triggers a defensive fight-or-flight response in the homeowner. They will instantly start justifying their behavior.
Right, they put their guard up.
Exactly. But saying, help me understand the situation, is collaborative. It assumes there is context the board might be missing, which invites the homeowner to explain rather than defend.
That's smart. But this is where the framework introduces a requirement that I initially had some serious reservations about.
Which one?
The absolute necessity of documentation during this informal phase. It says everything must be written down, dates, parties, what was discussed, what was agreed upon. Doesn't documenting every single informal chat feel incredibly passive-aggressive?
I can see how it looks that way.
Like instead of just having a friendly chat over the fence to sort things out, you are building a dossier on your neighbor.
I understand the discomfort with that. It definitely feels bureaucratic. But when the researchers mapped out the data regarding long-term community disputes, poor records and perceived favoritism consistently ranked as the top triggers for severe escalation.
So, keeping a log isn't about building a case to punish someone.
No.
It's about proving later on that you treated everyone equally.
That is part of it, yes. Documentation is the ultimate defense against claims of inconsistency. But more importantly, it protects the institutional memory of the community.
Institutional memory.
Yes. HOA boards change members constantly. People move, or their terms expire. If a dispute over a property line happens today, and they settle it with a handshake over the fence, what happens when that dispute resurfaces 2 years later?
Oh, the new board has no idea what was promised.
Precisely. A new board member might look at the property line, issue a violation notice, and completely contradict the verbal agreement made 2 years prior.
And that instantly reignites the conflict.
Exactly, and this time the homeowner is furious because they feel the board went back on its word. Thorough documentation provides a continuous, objective history that outlasts any individual board member.
Okay, the institutional memory aspect completely shifts my perspective on that. I get it now. So stage 1 is the 48-hour acknowledgement. Several conversations, open questions, and meticulous documentation.
Correct.
But what happens when the guy with the loud dog just refuses to acknowledge the community standard? What if talking just fails?
When informal resolution fails, we enter stage 2, mandatory mediation. Because of the legislative shift we discussed, you cannot just jump to a lawsuit.
You have to try to mediate.
Right. And the 2026 framework breaks this mediation stage down into 3 distinct escalating tiers based on the severity and nature of the dispute.
Let's examine those tiers because they really demonstrate how much thought has gone into scaling the intervention here.
Let's do it.
The first tier is board-facilitated mediation. This is free, and it's intended for minor neighbor disputes.
Yeah,
But the framework puts a massive asterisk on this tier.
it does.
It says it can only be used if the board's neutrality is absolutely unquestioned.
And in a hyper-local community, true neutrality is incredibly rare. If the board member facilitating the mediation has previously expressed an opinion on the dispute, or if they socialize with one of the parties, or even if they just live next door and have been indirectly affected by the noise, they are disqualified from facilitating.
Wow, any hint of bias at all?
If there is even a hint of bias, the mediation will fail before it begins.
Which naturally pushes a lot of disputes into the second tier. Community mediation services.
Yes.
This is for entrenched interpersonal disputes where the board recognizes they just need to step back.
Right.
The framework notes these services usually cost under $200, and they are often subsidized or provided for free via county court programs.
This is a highly effective tier for disputes driven by personal animosity rather than complex legal issues. The mediators in these county programs are trained specifically to de-escalate emotional conflicts.
So they aren't trying to be judges.
No, they aren't there to rule on who is legally right. They focus on active listening and cooperation, moving the focus away from the specific rule violation and toward repairing the long-term neighborly relationship.
But there are scenarios where a volunteer county mediator isn't going to cut it, right? Like the stakes get too high.
Exactly, and that is tier 3, the professional HOA mediator.
This is a paid, private professional.
Yeah.
The framework specifies using them for cases involving multiple parties, significant financial claims, or allegations of discrimination.
If we pull back and look at the literature review's findings on alternative dispute resolution, the consensus across all 128 papers is that this tiered mediation approach is highly cost-effective and significantly better at preserving long-term community relationships than litigation.
Because lawsuits just salt the earth.
Litigation destroys relationships permanently. Mediation at least offers a chance at repair.
But the research also makes it clear that mediation isn't like a magic wand. It doesn't work 100% of the time, does it?
It does not. The empirical studies reveal a critical caveat. Mediation only works if the mediator has actual authority, true neutrality, and strict control over the process.
Otherwise, it falls apart.
Right. If the parties feel the mediator lacks the training to manage a heated room, the process collapses into a shouting match.
That explains why the ground rules for Stage 2 are so intense. The framework mandates no interruptions. It requires parties to focus on specific issues rather than attacking someone's character.
It's very structured.
And the entire process must result in a written, signed agreement detailing exactly who will do what and by when. I noticed the preparation advice, too. It tells homeowners to bring specific sections of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&Rs, along with prior violation notices and written summaries of their position.
It's a lot of homework.
It really feels like prepping for a mini-trial.
It functions like a mini-trial, but one focused on achieving consensus rather than waiting for a judge to hand down a unilateral verdict. The intense preparation is vital because it acts as a grounding mechanism.
Grounding in what way?
Well, when you force people to bring the written documents, it shifts the conversation away from subjective feelings like, I hate how your house looks, and anchors it to objective rules. Section 4 limits fence height to 6 feet.
I see. I want to take these abstract processes and ground them in reality for a minute. We've talked about the mechanics of the law, but what are people actually fighting about out there in the cul-de-sacs? Let's take the 2026 framework and apply it to the actual anatomy of neighborhood wars.
The framework provides very specific application strategies for the most common disputes. Let's start with the undisputed king of neighbor complaints across all demographics: noise.
Oh, yeah. The loud music, the barking dog, the heavy footsteps.
It's everywhere.
The framework's best practice here ties right back to Stage 1. You acknowledge the complaint within 24 hours, but the key is how you communicate it to the offending party. You don't just send a letter saying, stop being loud.
Never just say that.
You cite the specific objective rule. You say, as per Section 7.4 of the CCNRs, quiet hours are from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m.
And there is a crucial don't attached to this scenario. The framework explicitly warns boards. Never, under any circumstances, tell the offending resident that a neighbor complained.
That feels counterintuitive again. Isn't transparency a good thing? Like, if a neighbor complained, shouldn't you just tell them?
You might think so, but volunteering that information instantly personalizes the conflict. Think about the psychological reaction. If I tell you, your music is too loud, a neighbor complained, your immediate reaction won't be to turn down the music.
It won't.
No. Your reaction will be to try and figure out who reported you. You'll think, was it Bob? I knew Bob hated me. He's just getting back at me for my tree branches crossing his property line last year.
Oh, so suddenly it is a personal vendetta.
Precisely. By citing the objective rule instead, the board makes the issue about the community standard, not about mob's sensitive ears. It depersonalizes the enforcement.
And then what?
And then the framework advises giving the situation 2 weeks to cool down after that initial notice before escalating further. Often, just knowing the board is aware of the objective rule violation is enough to correct the behavior without needing further intervention.
Right, take the person out of it, make it about the paper.
Exactly.
The second most common battleground the research identifies is parking and common areas. The insight here from the framework really surprised me. It says these disputes often stem from ambiguous or outdated rules rather than actual bad behavior by the residents.
This is a massive systemic issue in older HOAs. Many associations are operating on governing documents that were drafted by the original developers in the 1980s or 1990s.
Right, times have changed.
Exactly. Those older rules might mandate that all vehicles must be parked in a garage. But modern SUVs and trucks are significantly larger than vehicles were 30 years ago, and many literally do not fit into older garages.
Or the rules don't account for, like electric vehicle charging stations, or the fact that a typical household today might have 3 cars instead of 2.
Precisely. So before the board even thinks about escalating a parking fine or towing a vehicle, they are instructed to audit the rule itself. Does the rule they are trying to enforce actually make sense in 2026? Is it clearly defined in the current documents?
And if the rule is ambiguous or outdated, the framework says you have to fix the rule first before you punish the resident.
Yes.
You have to go through the legal mechanism of amending the CCNRs, which usually requires a community vote, before you start writing tickets.
It is a fundamental principle of procedural fairness. You cannot hold someone accountable to a standard that is physically impossible to meet or poorly defined in the governing contract.
Then we get to the third category, unpaid dues and assessment disputes. And the framework draws a very, very hard line here.
It has to.
This is treated completely differently than a noise complaint. This is not an interpersonal spat. This is a legal obligation.
When a homeowner stops paying their monthly dues, it directly threatens the financial viability of the entire community. It impacts the association's ability to pay for that skyrocketing insurance we discussed earlier. It impacts the landscaping, the structural maintenance, everything.
But the research indicates that the #1 cause of conflict regarding dues isn't simply people refusing to pay.
What is it then?
The conflict almost always arises from inconsistent practice by the board. It's when a board waives late fees for a board member's friend who fell on hard times, but enforces them strictly against a new resident they don't know well.
And this loops right back to the necessity of meticulous documentation and rigid processes. The framework outlines a standard, unbending timeline to remove all emotion and potential for favoritism from collections.
Okay, what's the timeline?
It mandates a 30-day late fee notice, a 60-day formal collections warning, and a 90-day property lien. Every single homeowner must be subject to the exact same timeline, without exception.
I want to focus on that timeline because it isn't arbitrary. The reason it is 30, 60, and 90 days is tied directly to the legal hurdles. An HOA must clear if they ultimately have to foreclose on the home to collect the debt.
Right. The law requires strict adherence.
You can't just fast-track taking someone's house.
Right.
You have to prove to a judge with a paper trail that you provided absolute, indisputable due process and multiple opportunities for the homeowner to cure the debt.
That is the exact legal mechanism at play. If you skip the 60-day notice because you are angry at the resident, a judge will throw out the lien, and the HOA will have to start the entire expensive process over from day one.
Which brings us to the final and definitely most severe category of disputes. Discrimination. specifically claims falling under the Federal Fair Housing Act.
Yes.
The directive from the 2026 framework here is loud and clear. Do not investigate this internally.
Absolutely not.
If a resident claims they are being targeted for enforcement due to race, religion, family status, or any protected class, the board must immediately refer the matter to the HOA's legal counsel.
A volunteer board is fundamentally unequipped to handle a federal civil rights allegation. Attempting to manage that internally through an informal chat over the fence or through a community mediation service is not just ineffective, it exposes the entire association to massive, potentially bankrupting legal liability. You must hand it to attorneys immediately.
Looking at these scenarios, the noise, the outdated parking rules, the strict collections timelines, it really shifts my perspective on what the board is actually supposed to be doing.
How so?
Well, in the noise complaint scenario, aren't they basically being asked to act as couples counselors for neighbors who just fundamentally hate each other?
It might look that way on the surface, but the 2026 framework is explicitly designed to do the exact opposite. It specifically removes the board from the counselor role.
Really?
Yes, by relying heavily on the objective CCNRs, the board shifts the conversation from "I think your dog is too loud" to "Here is the agreed-upon community standard regarding pet noise, which is a contract you signed when you closed on this house."
Okay, so it depersonalizes the conflict.
Completely. It removes the board from the messy interpersonal dynamics and grounds the dispute firmly in contract law.
The updated 2026 framework sounds incredibly logical when we lay it out like this. It's structured, it relies on objective rules, and it is meticulously designed to keep disputes out of the court system. But there's always a but.
There is always a but.
The 128-paper literature review reveals that this system is far from perfect. In fact, there are distinct vulnerabilities. We need to talk about the research gaps, what some sociologists are calling the dark side of mandatory alternative dispute resolution.
Indeed. While the macro-level data shows a significant reduction in court cases and legal fees overall, the granular sociological research highlights a severe vulnerability in the system. The most pressing critique of mandatory ADR is that without robust safeguards, it can severely disadvantage vulnerable or marginalized parties.
Wait, I'm stuck on this. If the system is strictly neutral-like, if the mediator isn't allowed to take sides, how does the homeowner end up at a disadvantage? Is it just a matter of who can afford better lawyers? Or is there a fundamental flaw in the mediation process itself?
It comes down to a philosophical and legal distinction between procedural neutrality and what researchers call substantive justice.
Walk me through that distinction.
Let's imagine a mediation table. On one side, you have a well-funded HOA board. They have the association's legal counsel advising them, they have property managers who know the bylaws inside and out, and they carry the institutional weight of the governing documents.
Sounds intimidating.
On the other side, you have a single, struggling homeowner. Perhaps English isn't their first language, or perhaps they are a single parent working 2 jobs who simply can't afford a lawyer of their own.
So it's like a high-stakes poker game where the HOA board is playing with the house's money, the community's legal budget, and the homeowner is betting their actual mortgage and living situation.
That is an excellent analogy. Now, the mediator sitting at the head of that table is trained in procedural neutrality. Their job is to ensure both sides get equal time to speak and that the rules of the mediation are followed.
Right.
But procedural neutrality doesn't equate to fairness if there is a massive inherent power imbalance in the room. The mediator isn't a judge. They aren't there to ensure the final outcome is morally just or legally sound. They are just there to facilitate a signed agreement.
Wait, so the mediator doesn't care if the deal is fair as long as both people sign it so they can close the file?
Essentially, yes. In these heavily imbalanced cases, mandatory mediation can sometimes act to suppress legitimate homeowner grievances. The homeowner, feeling overwhelmed, outlawyered, and desperate to bend the stress, simply gets steamrolled into accepting a terrible deal to avoid the threat of further conflict or the terror of an eventual lawsuit.
That's heartbreaking. Substantive justice, the actual fairness of the outcome, is basically sacrificed for procedural efficiency.
Yes.
Wow. So the system forces them into a room where they are entirely outmatched and essentially wears them down until they surrender. That's a huge structural flaw.
It is a significant concern in the literature.
And the literature review identifies another major issue, which they call the enforcement gap. The data maps this out clearly. It turns out many mediated settlements fail entirely post-agreement. Why? Because they lack binding authority or procedural clarity.
This is perhaps the most frustrating aspect for boards and property managers. You go through the entire agonizing process, you do the 48-hour acknowledgement, you manage the separate conversations, you hire the professional mediator, everyone sits down, they shake hands, and an agreement is signed.
Okay, so a deal is struck.
Let's say the resident agrees to take down an unapproved shed in their backyard within 30 days. Day 31 arrives, and the shed is still there.
So if a mediation agreement lacks binding authority, aren't we just forcing people into an expensive, time-consuming talking circle with no teeth?
That is precisely the major research gap identified in the academic text. What happens after the handshake? This is why the new legal frameworks, like Colorado's, are trying to attach those court-ordered certificates of compliance.
Right, trying to give it some legal weight.
They are trying to weave the mediation process into the formal legal system. But the enforcement of the outcome, actually making the person dismantle the shed as they promised, remains a highly complex gray area.
Because if they breach the mediation agreement, the HOA can't just send the police to tear down the shed. They find themselves right back where they started, having to hire a lawyer and go to court anyway to enforce the breach of contract.
Exactly. And it's not just an American problem. The international perspectives in the data show that globally, ADR is preferred for cost savings.
Even outside the U.S.
Yes. Whether you are analyzing a condo board in Toronto or an owner's corporation in Sydney, the preference is always to avoid court. But they face the exact same issues universally: a lack of participant buy-in and incredibly weak enforcement powers post-mediation.
It highlights a universal truth about community living. You cannot legislate neighborliness. You can mandate a strict legal process. You can force people into a conference room, but you cannot force people to act in good faith.
Which naturally drives us to the final and probably most vital section of the 2026 framework. If mediation has massive enforcement gaps and litigation is financially ruinous, the ultimate strategy has to be preventing the conflict from igniting in the first place.
If the cure has side effects, the best strategy is to not get sick. Prevention is the most powerful tool a board has.
Exactly.
The literature makes it abundantly clear that well-run HOAs don't just manage conflict efficiently, they actively suppress the overall volume of conflict through rigorous operational transparency.
The framework lays out several key prevention mechanisms. The foundation is having clear, accessible governing documents. We touched on this with the outdated parking rules.
Oh, right, the old PDFs.
If the community rules are buried in a 200-page PDF of scanned, blurry, typewritten documents from 1992, residents can't possibly be expected to follow them.
The modern standard requires putting these rules in plain, accessible language with searchable indexes easily accessible on a smartphone, because you cannot expect compliance with a rule that is impossible to find or requires a law degree to decipher.
The next preventative measure is what we discussed regarding collections. Consistent enforcement logs. Treating everyone exactly the same every single time. The key to achieving this consistency in 2026 relies heavily on technology.
Yeah, you have to get the neighborhood business out of the board president's personal email account or like a spiral notebook in their kitchen.
Definitely.
The framework stresses using centralized violation tracking via HOA management software. It creates a defensible, time-stamped record that any new board member can instantly access. But the prevention mechanism that struck me the most was proactive transparency, specifically regarding the budget and fee increases.
Communication is everything.
The research shows that homeowners are significantly more likely to accept a fee hike if they understand the why well before it happens.
It is entirely about the communication strategy and respecting the homeowner's intelligence. If a board knows in August that their master insurance premiums are skyrocketing, they should not wait until the annual meeting in December to drop a 15% dues increase on the community.
That's just asking for trouble.
They should be communicating that mathematical reality months in advance. They should share the raw data, the quotes from the insurance brokers, everything.
It's like finding out your rent went up. If you find out via a sticky note slapped on your door the day before rent is due, you are going to be furious.
Naturally.
But if your landlord sits down with you 3 months earlier, shows you the skyrocketing property tax bill, and explains the math, the pain of paying more money is exactly the same. But the anger, that feeling of being ambushed or manipulated, is completely different. You understand the necessity.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the data. The empirical evidence heavily reinforces that transparency and treating residents with respect practically guarantees a higher acceptance of unfavorable outcomes.
People just want to be treated like adults.
When people feel heard, informed, and respected, They are far less likely to view the HOA board as an adversary, and far more likely to view them as neighbors attempting to manage a difficult shared problem.
We have covered an incredible amount of ground today, and the mechanisms we've explored are vital for anyone living in or managing these communities. Let's recap the journey of this deep dive. We started with the sheer scale of the HOA phenomenon. 80 million Americans living in these governed microsocieties.
A third of the nation.
Right. We looked at the intense financial pressures of 2026, the skyrocketing insurance premiums, and how those economic realities turn up the heat on rule enforcement.
We then broke down the legislative shift led by laws like Colorado's HB 25-1123, which is moving the country away from a reactive sue-first mentality toward a mandatory sequence of alternative dispute resolution.
We explored the granular psychological tactics of the 2026 framework, the critical 48-hour acknowledgement rule to prevent secondary anger, the absolute necessity of separate conversations to maintain neutrality, and the delicate balance of the escalating tiers of mediation.
And we also faced the reality of the research gaps. The sobering fact that procedural neutrality can sometimes steamroll vulnerable homeowners, and that enforcing a handshake agreement remains a legal gray area.
Ultimately, the overarching lesson from synthesizing all 128 academic papers and the new legal framework is that rigorous process, unbending consistency, and absolute transparency are the only ways to survive local community governance.
And as we close this deep dive, there is one final lingering idea I want to leave you with, drawn directly from the open research questions section in the academic text.
What's that?
It's a profound question about the sociology of long-term community cohesion. We've spent all this time talking about how to efficiently manage disputes once they ignite, or how to legally mandate a sequence of mediation to keep cases out of the clogged court system. But consider this. If we have reached a point in society where we have to legally mandate that neighbors talk to a professional mediator before they sue each other, what happens to the community after the settlement is signed?
That's the real question, isn't it?
Does a forced, legally mandated agreement actually rebuild neighborhood trust? Or does it just create a quiet, permanent Cold War across the cul-de-sac where people just glare at each other while taking out the trash?
It makes you wonder.
As these new laws continue to reshape how a third of all Americans live, the real challenge isn't just figuring out how to stop the lawsuit. The real challenge is figuring out how to save the community.
A permanent Cold War across the cul-de-sac. That is a heavy, necessary thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you're driving through one of those serene, perfectly manicured neighborhoods, or the next time you see a notice taped to your own front door, I hope you'll think about the complex legal and psychological frameworks keeping the peace just beneath the surface. We'll see you next time.